The morning of June 12, 1962, began with a routine head count at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary that shattered the illusion of the inescapable prison. Guards walked the rows of cells in Block B, expecting to see the sleeping forms of inmates waiting for the morning whistle. When Officer Bill Rudder reached the cell of Frank Morris, he tapped on the bars to wake the prisoner, who appeared to be sleeping soundly under his blanket. There was no movement from the bunk, so the guard reached through the bars to prod the pillow. To his absolute horror, the head of Frank Morris crumbled under his touch and rolled onto the floor. It was not a human head, but a grotesque dummy made of plaster and paint. Panic surged through the cell block as guards checked the adjacent cells of John and Clarence Anglin, only to find similar decoy heads resting on their pillows. The men were gone, and the most famous prison break in American history had been discovered. Alcatraz Island sits in the middle of the San Francisco Bay, surrounded by freezing waters and treacherous currents that were long considered a natural death sentence for anyone foolish enough to attempt to swim. The federal government opened it as a maximum security prison in 1934, specifically to hold the most dangerous and disruptive inmates in the federal system. It was designed to break the spirits of men who had caused trouble at other penitentiaries. The psychological pressure of the rock was immense because the prisoners could see the lights of San Francisco and hear the sounds of city life drifting across the water on quiet nights. This proximity to freedom was a constant torture for the inmates, who knew that a mile and a half of deadly water separated them from the life they craved. The prison administration boasted that no inmate had ever successfully escaped and lived to tell the tale. Frank Lee Morris was the mastermind behind the elaborate plot that would eventually humiliate the Bureau of Prisons. He was a career criminal with a genius-level intelligence quotient of 133, giving him the mental capacity to analyze the weaknesses of the prison structure. Morris had been orphaned at a young age and spent his entire life bouncing between foster homes and reform schools, which hardened him against authority. He arrived at Alcatraz in January 1960 and was assigned to cell number 138. His criminal history included narcotics possession and armed robbery, but his most dangerous trait was his ability to observe patterns and exploit them. He was quiet and calculated, and he quickly identified other inmates who possessed the specific skills and temperament required for a complex escape attempt. John and Clarence Anglin were brothers born into a poor family of 13 children in Georgia, where they learned to swim in the strong currents of the Chattahoochee River. They were inseparable partners in crime who specialized in robbing banks and businesses when they were not working as seasonal farm laborers. The brothers were known for their athleticism and their ability to endure physical hardships without complaint. They had attempted escapes from other facilities, which is exactly why they were transferred to Alcatraz. John was assigned to cell 152, and Clarence was placed nearby in cell 154. They were soft-spoken but fiercely loyal to one another, making them the perfect muscle and support for the plan Frank Morris was beginning to formulate. They trusted each other implicitly, which was a rare commodity in a prison filled with snitches. The fourth member of the conspiracy was Allen West, who occupied cell 140 adjacent to the others. West was a car thief with a limited education, but he was handy with tools and maintenance work. He became the primary mechanic of the group, helping to fashion the crude instruments they would need to breach the concrete walls. Although West would play a crucial role in the preparation of the escape, he would ultimately be left behind in a twist of fate that saved his life and provided the Federal Bureau of Investigation with the only detailed account of how the plot was executed. Without the testimony of Allen West, the investigators might never have understood the sheer ingenuity of the tools and methods the inmates used to vanish from their cells. The plan hinged on the architecture of the cell house, which had been built decades earlier, and was beginning to show signs of age and salt air corrosion. Behind the rear wall of each cell was a 3-foot-wide utility corridor that housed the plumbing and ventilation pipes. Morris discovered that the concrete surrounding the air vent near the floor of his cell was crumbling and weak. If they could widen the opening of the vent enough to squeeze through, they would gain access to the utility corridor. From there, they could climb the pipes to the roof of the cell block, where they could set up a secret workshop. The audacity of the plan was staggering, because it required them to dig through concrete using nothing but stolen spoons and makeshift tools, while guards patrolled just feet away. The inmates began the arduous process of digging in December 1961, working in shifts during the music hour when the cacophony of accordions and guitars masked the sound of chipping concrete. They stole metal spoons from the dining hall and filed the handles down to create crude picks. They also scavenged discarded saw blades found in the prison workshops. The work was slow and blistering as they scraped away the mixture of cement and grit grain by grain. To hide their progress, they created false vent covers, using cardboard painted to look like the original metal grates. These fake covers were so convincing that guards walking past the cells during inspections never noticed that the real grates had been removed, and the holes behind them were widening every night. As the holes grew larger, the conspirators faced the challenge of disposing of the debris they excavated from the walls. They pulverized the concrete chunks into dust and scattered it in the exercise yard during their daily recreation periods. Some of the dust was flushed down the toilets in small amounts to avoid clogging the plumbing. The men worked with a disciplined rhythm, ensuring that their cells were spotless before the morning inspections. They knew that a single piece of loose concrete on the floor could give away the entire operation. This phase of the escape required months of tedious manual labor and nerves of steel as they slowly carved their way toward the utility corridor. Once the holes were large enough for the men to slide through, they began exploring the dark and dusty utility corridor behind their cells. This narrow space was a vertical shaft filled with pipes and conduits that ran from the ground floor up to the ceiling of the cell block. It was an unguarded zone that the prison administration had overlooked as a security risk. The inmates discovered that they could climb the plumbing pipes to reach the top of the cell block, which was an open space beneath the main roof of the building. This upper landing became their secret base of operations where they could store their materials and work on the most critical component of their escape plan without fear of discovery. The top of the cell block was cluttered with old ventilation fans and discarded equipment, which provided excellent cover for their illicit activities. The men took turns leaving their cells at night to climb up to this makeshift workshop. They established a lookout system to ensure that no guards were entering the utility corridor while they worked. In this hidden space, they began to construct the items they would need to survive the freezing waters of the San Francisco Bay. They knew that swimming without a raft was suicide, so they needed to build a vessel capable of carrying 3 men and their gear across the turbulent waves to Angel Island or the Marin County mainland. The primary material for their raft and life vests came from standard-issue military raincoats that were used by the inmates. The prisoners stole over 50 raincoats by taking them from other inmates or swiping them from the clothing supplies. These rubberized canvas coats were durable and water-resistant, making them ideal for constructing an inflatable raft. The process of turning raincoats into a boat was a feat of engineering that required precise cutting and stitching. They used the heat from steam pipes in the utility corridor to seal the seams of the rubber, pressing the material together until it fused. This vulcanization process was essential to ensure the raft would be airtight and buoyant. Glue was another critical component that they acquired in large quantities by stealing it from the prison glove factory. They filled small bottles with the industrial adhesive and smuggled them back to their cells and up to the workshop. The fumes from the glue were potent and could have easily alerted the guards, but the excellent ventilation on the roof helped disperse the smell. The men worked meticulously to stitch and glue the raincoats together, creating a 6-foot by 14-foot raft. They also fashioned crude wooden paddles from plywood they scavenged and hand-made life preservers using the same raincoat material. Every seam was double-checked because a leak in the middle of the bay would mean certain death. While the raft was being built, the inmates also had to solve the problem of the head counts that took place periodically throughout the night. They needed to be in 2 places at once working on the roof, while appearing to be asleep in their beds. This necessity birthed the idea of the dummy heads. They created a mixture of soap toothpaste and concrete dust to form a plaster-like substance. Using this material, they sculpted lifelike heads that matched their own facial features. The artistic ability displayed in these sculptures was remarkable considering the primitive materials they were using. They used the blunt end of their spoons to carve noses, chins, and eye sockets until the shapes resembled human faces. To make the dummy heads truly convincing, they needed human hair. The inmates worked in the prison barbershop or had access to the floor sweepings after haircuts. They carefully collected strands of hair that matched their own colors and textures. They glued this hair onto the soap heads, arranging it in the same style they wore. They even collected hair from the barbershop floor to create realistic eyebrows. The attention to detail was obsessive because they knew that in the dim light of the prison corridors, a guard would only need a split second of doubt to raise the alarm. The hair had to look natural against the pillow. Painting the faces was the final step in creating the decoys. They used art supplies stolen from the prison recreation kits to mix flesh tones. They applied the paint to the soap mixture, giving the dummy heads a lifelike complexion. They added details like closed eyes and slightly parted lips to mimic a sleeping person. When they tested the heads in their bunks, they arranged pillows and blankets to create the shape of a body underneath the covers. In the shadows of the cell, the illusion was perfect. A guard walking by with a flashlight would see the back of a head or a profile resting on the pillow and assume the inmate was fast asleep. The noise of their nocturnal activities was a constant concern, especially when they were widening the vents or moving equipment. To mask the sounds, Morris and the Anglins relied on the designated music hour, when inmates were allowed to play instruments. Morris played the concertina, an accordion-like instrument, and he would play loudly whenever the others were hammering or drilling. The wheezing sound of the concertina became the soundtrack to their excavation. Other inmates were unaware that the music was a cover for a prison break. The rhythm of the music dictated the rhythm of their work, creating a synchronized effort that kept their secret safe. One of the most impressive tools they built was a motorized drill made from the motor of a stolen vacuum cleaner. They dismantled the vacuum and attached the motor to a metal rod, creating a powerful device that could bore through the roof vent. They needed this drill to remove the rivets holding the fan guard in place on the roof of the prison. The drill was loud, so they could only use it during the loudest moments of the day or when thunder and rain battered the island. Finding an electrical outlet in the utility corridor to power the drill was another challenge, but West managed to splice into the prison wiring system. By May 1962, the preparations were nearly complete. The raft was finished and hidden on top of the cell block. The life vests were ready. The dummy heads were perfected and stored in the back of the cells. The holes in the vents were wide enough for the men to pass through. All that remained was to choose the right night for the escape. They studied the tide charts and weather patterns, looking for a night with heavy cloud cover to hide their movements from the guard towers. They decided on June 11, 1962, a night when the fog would be thick and the moon would be obscured. On the night of the escape, the men waited until lights out at 9:30 post-meridian. They placed the dummy heads on their pillows and stuffed clothing under their blankets to simulate their bodies. Then they removed the false cardboard grates from the air vents and squeezed into the holes. Frank Morris went first, followed by the Anglin brothers. They moved silently into the utility corridor and replaced the cardboard covers from the inside so the cells would look normal from the hallway. They met in the dark shaft and began the climb up the plumbing pipes to the roof. Adrenaline pumped through their veins as they ascended toward the top of the cell house. Disaster struck for Alan West in cell 140. The cement he had used to hold his false grill in place had hardened more than he expected, and the grill was stuck. He pushed and pulled with all his might, but he could not dislodge it. He could hear the others moving in the corridor behind the wall, but he was trapped in his own cell. West frantically tried to chip away the cement, but by the time he managed to remove the grill, the others had already left. He was left behind, forced to return to his bunk and wait for the inevitable discovery the next morning. His failure to escape became the key to unlocking the mystery for the authorities. Morris and the Anglin brothers reached the top of the cell block and retrieved their gear. They carried the heavy raft, the wooden paddles, and the life vests to the ventilation shaft they had prepared. They used their homemade drill and wrenches to remove the bolts securing the vent cover. The noise of the wind howling on the roof helped mask the sound of their work. They pushed the vent cover aside and climbed out onto the roof of the prison. They were now outside the walls, but they were still high above the ground and exposed to the searchlights if the fog lifted. The three men crept across the roof in the darkness, moving toward the bakery side of the building where the shadows were deepest. They had to be extremely careful to avoid making noise on the metal roof, which could alert the guards in the gun towers. They reached the edge of the roof and looked down at the ground below. They were near the prison fence, and beyond that lay the water. They slid down a large drain pipe on the side of the building, descending 50 feet to the ground. They hit the earth and immediately froze, scanning for guards. The coast was clear, and they scrambled toward the shoreline. They reached the water edge near the power plant, which was a blind spot for the guard towers. The smell of the salt water filled their lungs as they unfurled the massive raft. They used a concertina-like bellows made from a musical instrument to inflate the raincoats. It took precious minutes to fill the raft with air. The water was cold and dark, crashing against the rocks. They tossed their life vests on and waded into the surf, pushing the raft ahead of them. At approximately 10 post-meridian, they climbed aboard the makeshift boat and paddled out into the darkness of the bay, vanishing into the thick fog. The next morning, the routine head count revealed the deception. The siren wailed across the island, signaling a breakout. The prison went into total lockdown. Guards rushed to the cells and examined the dummy heads in disbelief. The craftsmanship was so good that from a distance they looked real. The warden was notified immediately, and the FBI was called in. A massive manhunt was launched, involving the Coast Guard, the local police, and federal agents. Boats and helicopters scoured the bay, searching for the raft or the bodies of the inmates. The authorities assumed the men had drowned, but there was no physical proof. Alan West was interrogated immediately. He cooperated, fully hoping to avoid punishment for his role in the conspiracy. He explained the entire plan to the agents, detailing how they built the tools, the raft, and the heads. He told them that the plan was to paddle to Angel Island Rest and then cross to the mainland to steal a car and clothes. His testimony provided the roadmap for the investigation, allowing the FBI to retrace the steps of the escapees. Agents climbed the utility corridor, found the workshop on the roof, and recovered the tools confirming West's story. The search continued for weeks, but the results were ambiguous. 2 days after the escape, a waterproof packet was found floating near Angel Island. It contained photographs belonging to the Anglins and a contact list. Later, a crude wooden paddle was discovered drifting in the water. A shredded piece of raincoat material was also found, suggesting that the raft might have broken apart in the rough currents. The FBI concluded that the raft had failed, and the men had likely succumbed to hypothermia in the frigid 50-degree water. However, no bodies were ever recovered, which kept the mystery alive. The discovery of the paddle and the wallet confirmed that the men had made it into the water, but it did not prove they died. The currents in the San Francisco Bay are powerful and can pull bodies out to sea through the Golden Gate. Skeptics of the survival theory pointed out that the men were not expert sailors and the raft was fragile. However, supporters of the escapees argued that the men were fit and determined. If they had managed to keep the raft afloat, they could have reached the Marin headlands. There were unconfirmed reports of a stolen car in the area that night, which matched the plan West had described. A Norwegian freighter ship reported seeing a body floating in the ocean about 20 miles past the Golden Gate Bridge on July 17th, weeks after the escape. The description of the clothing matched the prison uniform, but the body was not retrieved. This sighting became a key piece of evidence for the authorities to declare the men dead. They argued that the body was likely Frank Morris. The file remained open, but the official stance was that the escape was a failure. The legend of the invincible Alcatraz remained technically intact, although the security breach was a massive embarrassment. Years turned into decades, and the mystery only deepened. In 1979, the FBI officially closed their case, turning the responsibility over to the U.S. Marshals Service. The Marshals kept the investigation active, vowing to pursue the men until they were either arrested or proven dead. They released age-progressed photos of what the men would look like as seniors. Every few years, a new lead would emerge. A tip from a family member or a sighting in South America would reignite interest in the case, but nothing concrete ever materialized. The most compelling piece of evidence surfaced in 2015, when the Anglin family produced a photograph allegedly taken in Brazil in 1975. The photo showed two men standing near a termite mound who strongly resembled John and Clarence Anglin. Forensic experts analyzed the facial structures and concluded that it was highly likely to be the brothers. The family claimed that the brothers had survived and started a farm in South America. This revelation sent shockwaves through the true crime community and forced the Marshals to take a fresh look at the old files. Modern science has also weighed in on the escape. Researchers used computer models to simulate the tides and currents of the bay on the night of June 11, 1962. The study found that if the men had left between 11 post-meridian and midnight, the currents would have actually helped push them toward the Golden Gate Bridge and potentially to safety on the Marin coast. If they left earlier or later, they likely would have been swept out to sea or pushed back into the bay. The timing was the critical factor between life and death. The escape of Morris and the Anglins was the final nail in the coffin for Alcatraz. The prison was already suffering from high operating costs, and the salt water was destroying the infrastructure. The escape proved that the prison was not escape-proof, and the bad publicity was a political liability. Attorney General Robert Kennedy ordered the prison closed, and in March 1963, just months after the escape, the last inmates were transferred off the island. Alcatraz became a tourist attraction where millions of visitors now walk past the cells and see the vent holes the men dug. Today, the dummy heads are gone, replaced by replicas, but the story remains the defining legend of Alcatraz. The cells of Morris and the Anglins are preserved exactly as they were left. Visitors can peer through the bars and imagine the patience and desperation required to chip away at the walls with a spoon. The question of whether they survived remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. Did they beat the odds and live out their lives in freedom, or do their bones lie at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean? The cold waters of the bay keep their secret while guarding the truth, as strictly as the prison once guarded its inmates.